Started. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. I'm sorry I was unable to be here last week. My name is Ann Kinseth. I am the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum. It's my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Nancy Cohen Israel.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ann. Well, welcome back. We are cruising into a new century this morning, the 20th century, not the 21st, but it's going to bring us, one of the artists who we're all very excited to see. And of course, that's Joaquin Sorolla. So previously at the Luis Martín lecture series, we talked about a few innovations in the late 19th century, such as the introduction of the railroad that made it possible for people to get anywhere they wanted to go pretty quickly, from artists to patrons and everybody else, as well as the introduction of photography. And here I managed to meld the two of them into one image. But photography changed everything insofar as being able to capture a moment in time. It created a new sense of how to work with light and gave artists something to work against. And I don't mean that in a pejorative. I mean something that sort of to work, what could one do with painting that one could not do with photography is what I'm trying to say. We also saw how Paris became the center of the world, this brand new modern city. And we also looked at these two collectors, Catherine Wolfe in New York and William Hood Stewart, who was from Philadelphia, then went to Cuba, and then ended up in Paris, and their own contributions to the cultural life in the late 19th century. Catherine Wolfe, if you recall, not only donated many of her paintings to the new Metropolitan Museum of Art, she also put up the funds for the earliest art acquisition fund, the first art acquisition fund in the United States. And we'll talk about that today. And William Hood Stewart was a huge collector of contemporary Spanish painters. Why this is important is because some of those painters, such as Raimundo Madrazo, were also art brokers, as was Stewart. So Stewart was not only collecting, but also recommending these artists to his friends. So we talked about that circle last time, who was hanging around with William Stewart. And where were they by the year 1900? Well, unfortunately, Fortuny was dead. Mariano Fortuny had already passed away. Martín Rico was living in Venice. And I always love to show this work in our collection that came into our, was painted in 1903. But at this point, he was full-time in Venice. Roman de Erazu passed away shortly thereafter. And then Raimundo and Ricardo Madrazo were still in Paris painting. So I brought this in from our collection because it's such a beautiful image of this woman drinking tea. And I want you to pay close attention to what she's wearing, because this is going to be important as we talk about Madrazo this morning. The model is Aline Masson. She was his favorite model. And if you look at enough of his works, you'll see her over and over and over again. Into this group comes this young artist from Spain, about 30 years their junior, Juan Sorolla. And he's going to sort of fit into this group of artists. And at this point, in the late 19th, early 20th century, he's doing the only work he will do around social realism. Now, in the 1890s in Spain, there's this period of despondency, and it's called the generation of 1890. So the fact that he's painting sort of these melancholy scenes, as we saw and we'll see again with another Marguerite that we looked at last time, and this sad inheritance really falls in with what's going on aesthetically at the time. But today we're going to switch gears a little and look at some of the Americans who were following William Stewart's example to collect contemporary Spanish painting. And we'll also look at what they were collecting. And I want to start with Raimundo de Madrazo. Now, the Madrazos were a dynasty of artists. Raimundo Madrazo's grandfather, Jose, was a painter as well as a one-time director of the Prado Museum. Certainly, he had a lot of contacts. He was very well known. His son, Federico, was also a painter. And here we've got this beautiful portrait he did of his son on the right. and this lovely portrait of Vicenta Bertrand on the left that was newly acquired by the Meadows Museum. So if you've not yet seen it, it is on view in the Hammond Galleries. And I do encourage you to see it. And then just a little plug, I'm going to put my museum hat back on for a moment. We have a virtual program coming up next Wednesday about childhood in Spain. And our speaker, Dr. Coolidge, Grace Coolidge, will be speaking about this. So if you want to know more about her, tune in Wednesday. Anyhow, the whole family were painters. The uncles were painters. His brother was a painter, and his sister was married to Mariano Fortuny. So art was in their blood. And Raimundo really is straddling several eras. And when you think of it, he was born in 1841 and he died in 1920. So think of that in terms of art history. In France, especially, you've got realism, you've got impressionism, you've got post-impressionism, you've got cubism, fauvism, you've got all of these movements. So when you look at this work from the 1870s, 1880s, and you kind of maybe turn your nose up at a little bit, this is what was happening in France, and this is what people were collecting at the time. On the left, you've got the vanity. What's interesting, we had Professor Jasinski speak to us at Docent Training on Monday, and he talked about vanity, which, of course, as many of you know, is a deadly sin. But here it's called the vanity. So it's become a noun, and therefore all morality has been stripped out of it. And then the scene on the right, masqueraders. So these are periods, obviously, this is not how people were dressing in 19th century anywhere. So it's a look backwards. Again, take note of what these women are wearing in both of these images. The collectors of Madrazo's work were numerous. The American collectors included William Henry Vanderbilt, who bought this piece that's now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Masqueraders. And it was a big year for Madrazo because he won a medal, first-class medal at the Universal Exposition in Paris that year. So 1878 or this period was very important for him in Europe. And he was also elected as a member of the French Academy. And American collectors love these things. So if you remember, we looked at the Johnson household last time with just wall-to-wall paintings. If you're going to plaster your home with paintings, you want things that'll stand out, and this sort of fit the bill. Now, who else was collecting his work? None other than Henry Gibson. And if you recall, last time when I mentioned Gibson, he was the collector who William Stewart said knows no more about art than a cow. However, he was still buying the work of Martín Rico and Raimundo de Madrazo and numerous others. And among the works of Madrazo, this was not the actual painting that he owned. The one that he did was called Dancing the Hielo in the Palace of Pilate in Seville. And this one, it was just kind of like it. And apologies for all the ghosted images. The Prado Museum does not like to share their images, so I had to screenshot it really quickly. He does not have a little link to YouTube. That was not original to the painting. But again, even here, you've got this exoticism. If you remember with Rico, these artists were all looking back to Spain's own rather exotic past compared to the rest of Europe. Now, ultimately, he becomes this incredible portraitist. And what I find really interesting is Spanish painters have a really long history of moving between genres. So even reaching back into the 17th century, whereas in the rest of Europe, you would be a still life painter, a landscape painter, a history painter. In Spain, they all kind of did a little bit of everything. And so here you've got the same situation, even with these 19th century painters, that they were landscape painters, they did genre scenes, but they were also very much available to do portrait commissions, which is what we have here. And so these are portraits of ladies from the Vanderbilt family. Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who was born Alice Claypole Gwynn, and her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt. Do you see any similarities in their clothing between what we see? What color? Pink and white. So even if we go back Look at those women, pink and white. Well, that's his father. Pink and white. And we're going to see pink and white again. And the reason why I'm sort of belaboring this is because at one point somebody said, Munsey's magazine in 1902 published a story that said he seems to have a real understanding of the various moods and tempers of the ladies. So I don't know when color became gendered. I don't know if any of you know that, but it seems that he painted these women kind of frothy in all of these works. Now, did he only paint them in pink and white? No. And just for proof of that, you can go to the South Gallery that way, and we've got this beautiful portrait on the wall of a woman in black. So do not think that he only painted women in pink and white, because that is not true. But he painted enough of them for it to be noticeable. This little girl, Gertrude Vanderbilt, is going to become Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And so art is just running through the veins of these collectors. They also all had a fortune, and so they were putting it to very good use. Now, these were done, as I mentioned, in Paris, which meant that these Americans were making their way overseas to sit for this artist. In 1896, he made his first trip to the United States and traveled regularly back and forth between here and New York, especially. He also spent a lot of time in London and in Buenos Aires. So he got around. So many Americans seek him out as collectors. The Astors do, Mrs. Harry Payne Whitney, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, all in New York. But I want to sort of mention this family, the Peacock family. Do we have any Pittsburgh people here today? All right. Are you familiar with the Peacocks? Have you ever heard of them? Okay. Well, I don't know if those are the same Peacocks, because this is a phenomenal American rags to riches to rags again story. And the story is that you've got Mr. Peacock, Alexander Peacock, who was a Scottish linen salesman, made his way to New York. And his wife, Irene Peacock, who was a shop girl in New York because she came from a broken family in every sense of the word. I mean, her parents were divorced. When she got married to Mr. Peacock, they put that her mother was widowed because it was just such a disgrace to be divorced. But apparently there was a lot of abuse in the family. And so it was just a terrible situation. It was not what you think of, American robber barons. Anyhow, legend has it that one of them met Mrs. Carnegie, and it's believed that it was the husband who was selling her linen in a store. And she said, "Oh, I noticed your Scottish brogue. Where are you from?" And he mentioned where he was from. And she said, "Oh, just like my husband, Andrew Carnegie. And you're a very enterprising young man. Why don't you interview with my husband and, his steel company?" And so he works his way up to just extraordinary heights in the Carnegie steel companies. So much so that they end up moving to Philadelphia, of course, the center of the steel trade at that point. They end up buying this home. So they, when it is sold to U.S. Steel in 1901, their net worth becomes $15 million. And they built this giant home that might not look that big, maybe not only by Dallas standards, but it took up a city block, and it was called Rollina. Rolla. And so it was obviously the talk of the town. They were the talk of that town. If you've got a house this big, there's nothing worse than blank walls, right? Especially in the 19th, early 20th century. They fill it with art. They're buying art of the Barbizon's artists. They're buying the work of Daubigny, Charles Daubigny, who we talked about last time. And of course, they're commissioning portraits of themselves. And here you've got, see this wonderful entrance hall. They had a housewarming party for themselves, to which they invited 800 people. And we are told that Mrs. Peacock greeted each one of them in the gown that she wore for her portrait. And it's spectacular. I mean, I think we can all agree on that. And what color is it? Pink and white. There you go. Now, we also know, because she writes, that Signor and Signora Madrazo actually picked out the fabric. So we know she had this dress made according to their specifications for this portrait, which suggests this is not a coincidence that all of these paintings are done in pink and white. It's done very much like an 18th century British portrait. It falls into a long line of portraiture with, the lady with the gardens behind her, the man with the office behind him. And, they're sitting very imposingly. Now, this made such waves that they even ran this whole series in the Pittsburgh Index of first stage, showing how the head was roughly blocked in. And they have bit by bit by bit how this portrait was made. So it was a huge, huge, much anticipated thing. And again, Pittsburgh's not New York. Pittsburgh's not Philadelphia. Having driven Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, it's not that close. It might look so on the map, but it's not. So this was, they were sort of the talk of society. Now, to give you an idea of how this is different from other celebrity portraits, if you will, of the time, here we see Helen Clay Frick, of course, from another very prominent Pittsburgh family, Henry Clay Frick's daughter, done by an artist named Théobald Chartrand. And he was, again, the artist to the stars. But I think we can all agree that Mrs. Peacock, even if this does look a little British 18th century, she seems far more alive and far more contemporary than this portrait of Helen Clay Frick, which sort of, to me, has this little like Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette playing peasant sort of look to it. It's this very soft, almost syrupy kind of, I'm sorry, I don't, if anyone likes it, that's great. But it's a very different type of aesthetic, also painted like in this gauzy white with the pink ribbons, etc. But that far away look is just so kind of 19th century romantic, where here, Mrs. Peacock's looking you in the eye. Now, not all stories have a happy ending. And this is one of them, because they end up at one point, Mr. Peacock decides to go out on his own. Bad idea. They end up moving back to New York City. You know that when you take your wedding vows for richer or for poorer, well, this was not a happy ending, because when he died, even though they still had a lot of money, or not $15 million, but they were doing okay, he left her $5 in his will. I think he left $100 for his son, and then like $10,000 for his valet. It was just so insulting. So yeah, but they certainly had fallen on much harder times. Their home was destroyed 4 years later, and the collection dispersed. And in fact, divine justice for being such an arrogant person, that portrait of him is unknown. His whereabouts are unknown. So, and this one she did get to keep, and it was recently conserved in the year 2000. 2000. So you can see, it's just gorgeous. He died in 1921, I believe, in 1928, and she died in 1947 at the age of 83. So she went on to have a really long life. And I just think, sorry to do a deep dive on this, but there are these little stories that sort of spice up our history that I find absolutely fascinating, especially from this period. As is often the case with all of these artists, and we've seen so many self-portraits, and we will continue to see them, he did this portrait of himself in 2 days. Now, I don't know what it is about these artists, but they were moving. And when we get to Sorolla, you'll hear just what his staggering output is. And, here he's looking at like a very pensive painter, very thoughtful painter. You can see that he's got his Legion of Honor. Let's see if I can. lapel pin. So this that was awarded to so many of these Spanish painters, which they wore with pride. They always included, and we'll see him again wearing that. Okay, say you're Mrs. Madrazo. What do you think if your husband says, I've done a self-portrait, I'd like you to have it? What's your reaction to this one? Thank you, dear. Are you going to finish it? Would you like to have this staring down at you in your dressing room? Neither did she. So, but his wife found it entirely much too stern. And, of course, we don't have video recordings of him. We don't know how animated he was, but apparently more so than he portrays himself in this portrait. And so he gave it to his friend, the collector Ava Purdy Thompson. And he had painted her portrait the year before, and unfortunately I couldn't find it. But what she said when he gave it to her was, no one can ever know the joy to this day to have that portrait. It all seems unreal, and I long to have it. I long to have it here where it shall be mine. So somebody was thrilled to have this stern portrait of this animated or potentially animated genius. But I agree with you, Alita. I mean, his hands, if you check out his hands here, we all hear how difficult it is to paint hands, but we know that he could actually. But ironically, as a painter, what he's missing are his hands here with this very dark background. And part of the reason, last time I mentioned that the Galerie Espagnole had opened in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. And at that point, the work of Diego Velázquez was suddenly getting huge reattention. He had sort of fallen off everybody's radar, but suddenly it was a revelation. And certainly for the Spanish artists who, even if they weren't from Madrid, made their way to Madrid, to the Prado Museum to see his work, they were all mind-blowingly overwhelmed by his work and really influenced by it in many ways. Now, I mentioned that Madrazo was also an art broker. He was the go-to guy for American collectors looking to buy the work not only of El Greco, so he worked in Spanish old masters, and remember, his grandfather had been a director of the Prado, so they knew where to find things, but also of the work of Goya. Now, why would he be selling the work of Francisco Goya? Well, Goya's son and his grandson came to him and said, we've got all this work by Francisco Goya. If you can please help us find a home for it. Now, we are incredibly fortunate to have this portrait of his grandson, Mariano, in our collection. Mariano, if you haven't already heard this, was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And in fact, when he fell on hard times, when he sort of ran out of money, he actually sold this portrait that his grandfather did. Not only did, but did when he was 81 years old, did when he had to get himself from France and Bordeaux, where he was living, back to Spain, paints his grandson and inscribes it on the back to my grandson Mariano, from Goya, age 81. So we know that Mariano was always looking to make a little bit of extra cash. But this was really a wonderful thing for us to have. And we did not go through Raimundo Madrazo to get this portrait. Just saying, we acquired it 2015, whenever we had the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago. Now, to give you an idea of the league that Madrazo was playing in, none other than Louisine Havemeyer, remember we talked about them last time, about what big collectors they were, intervened. At one point, she wrote to Henry Clay Frick herself. And she says there's this El Greco that she is really pushing for him to have. And she said, writes to Frick, I shall be very glad to know that you have a fine Goya. This one called La Tirana. The portrait he, which is Madrazo, refers to is a full length with a white shawl draped over the shoulders. I think you saw it. So Frick actually does buy this. He buys it for 200,000 francs. And after the sale goes through, the owner, a certain Marquesa, says, you know what? I'd like another 100,000 francs. At which point he says, no, the deal is off the table. And this was in 1911. But we do know that Frick bought another major Spanish old masterpiece in 1911, and that was Velázquez's Fraga Philip that we had here last year. And I'll bring a slide in next week of it. Madrazo also played an important role in helping Archer Huntington, who we'll be discussing quite a bit this morning, collect Spanish old masters. And to give you an idea of how connected he was to contemporary Spanish painters, here's this beautiful portrait done by Joaquin Sorolla of Madrazo, where we see him later in life, again with his lapel pin from the Legion of Honor, seated in his garden, looking quite content and prosperous too. And one of the things I love about this painting by Sorolla is it sort of combines everything. It combines this friendship with this other older painter and also one of these gorgeous garden scenes. It would have probably been a little unseemly to paint him at the beach, but we have him in a garden. Another artist, I mean, yes, he was an artist, but he played a huge role in helping Americans collect, was Orellana de Berruete, who actually trained to be a lawyer and was, as is the case with many lawyers, decided the law was not for him. He had actually served in the government as a deputy, but he really wanted to be a painter. And not only did he have his own means and his family means, but he had his wife's fortune too, Maria Teresa, because she came from a family of bankers. They were also first cousins, but yeah, and they weren't even Habsburgs. Anyhow, but he was very busy going around Spain painting. He went to Toledo, as you see here. I brought this view of Cuenca in for those of you who recall our spring exhibition of work from Cuenca. So he was really following in this tradition of landscape painting that we've seen so much. I want to especially point out the Alcantara Bridge in Toledo that he painted in 1906. Sear that in your brain for a few moments, because that's going to be really important. He eventually goes to Paris. He meets up with Martin Rico and others. While he's still in Spain, while Sorolla is still in Spain, he starts introducing Joaquin Sorolla around. Before Sorolla's any kind of a big deal hotshot artist, he starts using his own connections to introduce Sorolla to this class of wealthy patrons. And so in some ways, he helped Sorolla get his foot on the ground painting portraits in Spain. He was very much another devotee of Velázquez. He wrote one of the first monographs about him in 1898 in Paris. And he was also brokering the sale of works by not only Velázquez, but also El Greco to people such as Henry Clay Frick. So again, I find it really interesting that these Spanish artists, brokers had this really unique connection to this collecting class in New York. Now, Sorolla paints these two portraits, these pendant portraits. He actually paints his wife on the right first, of Maria Teresa. Very Spanish, both of them. I mean, a very dark palette. You've got in the one on the right, you've got on the easel one of these views of Toledo. Berruete was a big fan of the San Martin Bridge, and of course, that's going to be important for us as we talk about Sorolla. And this work caught the attention. These works caught the attention of Archer Huntington in London. So these works were part of the, are you ready? 450 paintings that went on view in London in 1908. And among the international guests was Archer Huntington. And Huntington says to him, I would really like to have these for my collection. And so Sorolla goes back to Berruete and says, you know, this American collector would very much like to have these for your collection. And I don't know about you all, I think it's kind of weird. Unless it's somebody who I really know and respect, I don't know that I would buy a portrait of a living person. Somebody I have no connection to. In any case, it didn't happen because what Berrueche says to him, he writes to him and he says, as you know, I intend to donate it and the one of Maria Teresa to the Museo Moderno. I know that it would make you, I know that you would make me another one and that it would be even better, which is really something. But this canvas is very special to me. It belongs to a time now gone and is something I do not think could be achieved again, even if the new one were better in terms of art. You are, of course, aware that it has been very successful ever since it was first displayed and have been envied by many. Consequently, and in spite of the deep respect I feel for you, I sincerely regret that I will be unable to fulfill your request on this occasion. So I find it interesting, too, not only that Huntington wants to buy these, but that they're even out in the world. I mean, if I had a portrait by Sorolla, it would be hanging in my house. It'd be glued to the wall. But somehow these are able to go out into the larger world. And I don't know if he was using this, he was allowing Sorolla to do this as sort of a calling card to get other patrons to commission him. These works indeed do go into the Modern Museum in Madrid, but it closed in 1971. And so now they're in the Prado Museum. When he died, when Berrueche died in 1912, Sorolla actually held an exhibition of his works at the Casa Sorolla in Madrid. So the respect that they had for one another, the friendship that they had for one another, the bond that they had for one another was really quite large. There's one artist I'm skimming through really quickly who also had American patrons, and I just need to mention him because we have one of his works in the collection. I don't know if Claudio Castelluccio is a household name. How many of you are familiar with his work? Okay, our docents, which is good. That's a good thing, but not, as I said, a household name. He was another Spaniard whose family had moved to Paris at the beginning of the 19th century. And here you can see he's kind of blending. You sort of have like a little Toulouse-Lautrec meets Spain and a little, modernism / flamenco. So he's creating kind of this fusion. Now, he also studied with James McNeill Whistler. So again, this sort of cross-pollination between American art and Spanish arts in Paris. He became a teacher first at the Académie Colarossi. And in 1905, there was another academy that opened called Académie de la Grande Chaumière. It was founded by two women. And again, this is another one of these little rabbit hole stories that I find fascinating. It was founded by two painters, a French painter named Alice Dannenberg and a Swiss painter named Martha Stettler. And they were both part of an avant-garde movement on the left bank who called themselves Les Quelques, the few. They also created an exhibition, put on an exhibition in 1904 of avant-garde art called Tendance Nouvelle, New Trends. Again, has anyone heard of these women? I think now is the time. So our artist here, Castelluccio, went to teach this new academy. Most of his students were foreign. And you may have heard of some of them. They included Louise Bourgeois, Alexander Calder, Isamo Noguchi, Alberto Giacometti, and Tamara de Lempicka. So, heavy hitters. And there's the little, you get to see who else was teaching with him. The masters, not one of them is a woman, but anyhow. One of his students was this woman, a student from Texas named Mary Cronin. And I will admit, when we first got this painting in the collection, I wasn't overwhelmed by it. I know, not to disparage anything at the Meadows Museum, but it was not my favorite new acquisition. However, I find the story fascinating because she actually studied with Castelluccio for 5 years. And she came back to Texas and ended up painting all of these notables in Texas. And I brought some in, but then I thought I'd rather spend the time talking about Sorolla. However, before we leave her completely, and again, it seems like this very lovely portrait of an early 20th century woman. This painting showed in all the best exhibitions. It was shown in Paris, the Salon of the Société des Beaux-Arts in 1906. The following year in Berlin at the Salon of the Gallery Eduard Schulte. And then in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Institute's 12th Annual International Exhibition in Pittsburgh. Now, little known fact, the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh was the first museum in the United States to open that was devoted to contemporary art. And so it was clearly they saw something in this that was unique, that was different, that was avant-garde. And so this was not so much, yes, she came home with a portrait by her teacher, but she was also disseminating his style throughout, in the portraits that she did. Now, let's get to the main event, Joaquin Sorolla, whose work is just so magnificent. And, I know many of us really loved and appreciated the exhibition we had here in 2013, 2014, because it was gorgeous. But it really wasn't until I was preparing for this that I realized how significant that was, because so many of these phenomenal works were in that exhibition. So I hope that you all had a chance to see it, because it was truly a blockbuster. Sorolla was born in Valencia in 1863. So unlike Madrazo, who came from artistic nobility, or Berruete, who came from financial comfort, he was orphaned at the age of 2, he and his sister. Raised by an aunt and uncle, he started painting when he was 9 years old. And when he was about 13, he went to work, because that's what 13-year-olds did, unlike now. But he went to work for the father of one of his friends. And that man was a photographer named Antonio Garcia del Castillo. And Del Castillo it gave him an opportunity to work in new media. Photography was new media at that time. So when you think of it that way now, it's sort of like ho-hum. But what was so important in late 19th, early 20th century photography was the use of light and being able to capture light. And when you think of black and white films from the following eras, you know that what they relied upon was light, and that's what made them great. And so this ability to use and manipulate light is something that's going to be really important to Sorolla. The other thing it allowed him to do, it gave him the technological know-how, so that when he was painting and just painting and painting and painting, he was able to photograph all of his work and keep notations and keep records of all of it. And this is going to be important. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. At this point, he's still just working for this man. He ends up going to the Prado. And at the age of 18, he goes to Madrid, he goes to the Prado. And of course, whose work does he love? Thank you, Velázquez. He goes to Rome, because that's where people went. He goes to Paris, because that's where people went. And this painting, this lovely little painting, Italian Girl with Flowers from 1888, is actually the very first one of Sorolla's works to come to the United States. You can see it's a very sort of loose brushwork. It almost has the feel of Fortuny's work, and Fortuny still had, even though he had already passed away, but his influence was still quite strong at that point. He moves back to Valencia in 1888, so the same year this is done, because among other things, another benefit of his former employer was his former employer's daughter, Clotilda, for whom he had a great deal of affection. So he returns to Valencia in 1888 so that he and Clotilda can get married. And it's a very romantic story. It's a very well-suited, well-matched couple. She is not only his wife, but his muse. And if you've seen the exhibition upstairs, if you know anything about Sorolla, you know Clotilda is always right there. And you've got this stunningly spectacular portrait of her in black that was done in 1906. So they were still kind of newlyweds at this point. It was, they got married in 1888, and this is 1906. And you see in the background one of his early paintings. I love just sort of the sass that she's got. Very, very kind of an intimate portrait of her. In addition to being his muse, she's also his business manager. And he actually refers to her as my treasury minister. And having grown up around photography, she was the one doing all the record keeping. Again, when you hear about how prolific he was, it's stunning. But it also was a tremendous gift to us for posterity, because when we had the 2013 exhibition, Sorolla in America, we had in the back just all these images of works whose whereabouts are unknown. And they were hoping from that exhibition to sort of relocate some of those paintings. I did ask Blanca Sorolla, who is the curator of the current exhibition and the artist's great-granddaughter, if they were able to recover any of those in the past 10 years. She said they found some, but none of them are in the exhibition. But just think of what a gift, what foresight that was. Now, if you look at this portrait, when was it sold? 1909. It came out of the big exhibition of 1909. And where did it go? The Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, again, I know we have some painters in here. I don't know if I did a portrait of my spouse, I don't know that I'd want it on full view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but he could always paint another, let's be honest. And he did with clothes on, with clothes off. I mean, all kinds of variations as we see upstairs. Now you've got this, very hopeful scene, but he's also painting, as I mentioned, these earlier works that still have a degree of social justice. So another Marguerite that we talked about last time, I brought it back just to show you another one of these paintings that he did of the white slave trade from 1895. Again, sort of this despondent look. Another Marguerite, if you recall, was one of this is the first painting that sold in America. And it was acquired in 1893 by an American in the Midwest in Chicago, but it had actually won the gold medal in Madrid for their exposition, their national exposition, but nobody was interested in buying it. Came here, it sold. And this painting, another Marguerite, was the one that Sorolla said it was his first step on really firm ground. Sad Inheritance is the last of these social realist paintings that he's going to paint. And again, just like another Marguerite, it was a scene that he said he witnessed. You've got these children who have some kind of disability staggering into the ocean. It was so devastating to Sorolla to see these really kind of helpless children and just, look at the child to caregiver ratio. I mean, you've got this one priest trying to help so many kids get into the water. And, it was almost more than Sorolla could take. So he said, this is it. I am done painting this. However, the painting was very good to him because in 1900, it won the Medal of Honor at the Paris Exposition. In 1903, it came to the United States. When it won in Paris, when it won that honor, it meant that he got his red lapel pin. He entered the Legion of Honor because of this painting. When it was showing in Paris, a few other artists came to see it. And that included John Singer Sargent and Anders Zorn. And Zorn is another one of these artists whose reputation needs to be revived. In spite of the success that it had in Europe, nobody wanted to buy it. Who bought it? Actually, it went back to Spain, and it was a Spanish businessman named Jesus Vidal who bought it for 40,000 pesetas. But he was a businessman in New York. So it ended up coming back to New York. So I guess that's sort of half and half. I mean, it was bought by somebody Spanish, came to New York. It ended up going into the collection of another American, John Berwind, who ended up giving it to the Church of the Ascension in New York. And it stayed there until 1981, at which point it was sold at auction. And it's back in Spain now. Any questions so far? No, I'm going quickly. Okay. This one never came to America, but I think it's gorgeous. And so I brought it, called Mending the Sail. And this is one of these really sort of pivotal pieces. So it's still done in the 1890s when he's been doing social realist work. But look at the light. I mean, these might be laborers, but they're not in sweatshops. I mean, they're working outdoors. This billowing white fabric is stunning. The way he captures the light on it is magnificent. The way the light is dappled on all of these people is magnificent. And then in the background, you've got the sea at Valencia, which is going to dominate his practice really around 1904, 1905. Now, in 1904 alone, he painted 250 paintings. That is enormous, including works such as this. And this one ended up now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but at the time it was acquired in 1904 by the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art. And I'm not sure when that change took place, but not only does it show these children in the sun and just, again, the use of light, the way it reflects off the skin here and here and here off the hat. It's just so vibrant and so alive and really antithetical to Sad Inheritance, which even though that takes place by the sea, this is just vibrant. One of the things Dr. Roglan used to always talk about with Sorolla's water is, water is constantly moving. It's never still, and to be able to capture that is extraordinary. And I brought all these in, this one's in particular, just to show you that Sorolla was not an unknown quantity in the United States. So as early as 1905, the Art Institute of Chicago had proposed a huge exhibition that would go to Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Buffalo, and Boston. Didn't happen, but what did happen instead was in Paris in 1906, he had another enormous exhibition of 450 works. And I just want to sort of pause and think about who had to install that. There is an art to installation. I can't even imagine how long they took to do that. And it was at the Galerie Georges Petit. And it was here again that he had gotten the nomination for the Legion of Honor with Sad Inheritance, but he actually became a full officer in the Legion of Honor because of this exhibition. It did extremely well. He sold a lot of work, including this carob tree that you see on the left, which came to America at the time of its purchase in 1898. Pines of Galicia eventually came to America. At the time, it was bought by a French collector, and it came here in 2019, recently, and it's in a private collection, and it's upstairs right now. So I do hope if you have not gone up, you will see the exhibition today or at some point. This was followed up in 1907 by an exhibition in Germany. Went to Berlin, Dusseldorf, and Cologne. Another 450 paintings. I mean, again, these were not the same 450 paintings. So yes, he sold some, but he was just incredibly prolific. This one, a view of Las Pedrizas. His family was staying here in 1907. His older daughter was recovering from tuberculosis. And so he was painting the landscape around him. It sold in London in 1908. It was acquired in 1965, which meant, again, in Mr. Meadows' lifetime. Now, the big, huge breakout was this London exhibition in 1908. And here, among other people he met, were this young American Hispanicist named Archer Milton Huntington, who would become his greatest champion. At this show, Huntington bought 3 paintings, 2 portraits, and this little lovely, almost genre scene, The Peppers. So who was Huntington? Huntington's dates are 1870 to 1955. He was the only child of Annabelle Duval Huntington and Collis Potter Huntington, who theoretically wasn't his biological father, but maybe he was. So they traveled a lot. Huntington himself was a voracious reader. He spoke many languages. He loved art. He loved history. He was a brilliant man, but he had a particular fondness for everything Spanish and Portuguese. And when Collis died in 1900, he left young Archer his estate that was worth $150 million in 1900. That translates to roughly $3 billion today. Imagine being able to truly do anything you want. And what he wanted was to create a center for Spanish art, Spanish and Portuguese art in the United States. And so in 1904, he establishes the Hispanic Society of America. And he dedicated it to being a free library and a free museum and otherwise a repository for everything that he could find. So imagine it continues to be free to this day, but clearly he had the means to endow it. Let me give you some statistics as to what he put into this institution. He had a library of over 15,000 books pre-1700, over 200,000 manuscripts, 175,000 photographs, 17,000 prints and posters, and 19,000 works of art, which included paintings, sculptures, drawings, and decorative arts. Incredible. Clearly, it was a who's who of artists. You want a Velázquez? Done. You want, whatever, El Greco? Done. You want 3 of them? Done. And so who was helping him? Raimundo and Ricardo de Madrazo, as well as Berruete. And of course, they were also advising him on Goya. Huntington had seen Sad Inheritance in Paris in 1900. And so, he knew Sorolla's work. When the Hispanic Society officially opened its doors in January of 1908, he decided that he really wanted to, bring a contemporary artist to New York. So he invited not only Sorolla, but also Ignacio Zuloaga to come with their work to America. Sorolla said, absolutely. Zuloaga said, I'll pass. And I don't know why. I can't imagine. And especially when you hear about the astounding success that Sorolla had. And to give you an idea, this was the installation. This is what it looked like when he had that exhibition. So Huntington agreed to pay all transportation costs. Sorolla went with 356 paintings, shipped in 3 consignments that's Huntington paid for. He paid for all the insurance, and he paid for the printing of 20,000 catalogs. It was a huge bet, but it was such a success. And if you see it here, we'll get back to that. It was such an enormous success. How many of you have been to the Hispanic Society? All right. Well, that's a good start. The next time the rest of you go to New York, put it on your itinerary. It is not easy to get to. It's not easy to get to in 2023. It requires buses or Ubers or whatever. It is on Broadway between 155th and 156th Street. So imagine getting there in the year 1909. Imagine that there were over 600 people who came to see it in the first 4 days. Imagine that in the first month, or the only month that it showed, there were 160,000 people who made that pilgrimage way uptown to go see the work of Joaquin Sorolla. And here you can see the installation, and you can see right in the center this beaching the boat that we've got here on the right as well. The catalog sold out. Institutions were buying the work. The Metropolitan Museum of Art bought 3 paintings, including the Clotilda that we saw, and this one, Havea, using funds from Catherine Wolfe's acquisitions endowment. The Hispanic Society at the time of the exhibition, bought 3 paintings. The Buffalo Museum, when it goes to Buffalo, is going to buy 2. And of course, individuals are buying them up. And so here's one that was also acquired at the time, Children in the Sea, Valencia. Other works that were sold, again, for those of us familiar with the Meadows Museum, our 2 pieces, Farmhouse at Alcira, which had been shown all over European exhibitions in Berlin and Paris and London, but it wasn't until it got to New York that it found a home. Ultimately, it was donated to the Meadows Museum. Blind Man of Toledo was bought from that New York exhibition as well in 1909 by a man named William Lowenstein. He paid $1,200 for it. So again, really a king's ransom at that time. And then another painting of a garden in Seville, the Alcazar, that was sold to a Mrs. Burden. She paid $1,000 for it. And just other fun fact, those little tiny paintings we've got upstairs, you could buy those for $100, which, now doesn't seem like a lot, but it was still an investment in 1900. Now, Sorolla didn't speak any English, so it should be noted that he had a student who had traveled to Spain, a man named William E. Starkweather. He traveled to Spain to study with Sorolla, and he became Sorolla's right-hand man in the United States. He greeted him at the dock when he came in 1909 with his wife and with his family, and he was with him throughout this East Coast tour and the middle of the country tour that we'll talk about next time. But Sorolla was showing himself to be a very able portraitist as well. So as early as 1907, you've got this portrait of King Alfonso the 13th in a hussar's costume. We've got the study for it upstairs now in the exhibition. And this phenomenal portrait of Esperanza Conil de Zanetti, very different, certainly different from the portraits we saw of Raimundo de Madrazo. She was a Cuban woman. She was married to a professor at Columbia University named Joaquin Enrique Zanetti. His specialty was chemical weaponry, so somehow I suspect he was doing well enough that he could commission Sorolla to do a portrait of his wife. Those of you familiar with Sargent's portraits may recall Madame X, and they were good friends, so this was sort of their little tug of war. But I just love her. She's like ready for action. This is one of my favorite paintings in this current exhibition. And the exhibition, I'll just have a few more slides here quickly. The exhibition moved to the Buffalo Fine Arts Academy, much lighter. So instead of the 356 works, there were only 206 paintings left by the time it went to Buffalo. And this was in March. It is not springtime in Buffalo in March. Even though, they had 23,000 people come in the month that it was up. One of the commissions that came was for our then president, William Henry Taft. And this was a wonderful time. Sorolla had to go to Washington, D.C. to paint this. And one of the things he was having a hard time with Taft was he was having such a good time. And he wanted Taft to look more serious, to look like all those portraits of Raimundo de Madrazo, like serious, stern man of business. But they were having a really fine time. And so I know that somebody's alarm. I'll wrap up quickly. But he said that Washington, D.C. was pleasant but dirty. And President Taft paid $3,000 for this portrait, which was done over the course of 6 days, April 6th to the 12th. President Taft spoke Spanish. And so again, not only did President Taft get a portrait, but Sorolla got an invitation to dinner at the White House. And I don't know about all of you, but that was growing up. That was always the thing. My mom said, what if you get invited to dinner at the White House? Well, Sorolla did. And then the final stop on this East Coast tour was in Boston, where the remaining works were shown at the Copley Society for 3 weeks. The opening was so well attended that Sorolla wrote to Huntington saying, I suppose you've heard about Boston, and I can tell you that the reception was splendid, and my right hand was almost useless. I calmly gave more than 500 handshakes. So clearly they were looking forward to seeing him. Our man, Mr. Starkweather, gave 2 talks, one at the Copley Place, the other at the Boston Public Library, about Sorolla, slide lectures. This was new. I'm sure the slides were awful, but they were slide lectures nonetheless. Sorolla himself spent little time there because he was so busy in New York. He got 28 portrait commissions on that 5-month trip to the United States. 21 of them were in New York. They still welcomed 18,000 people over the course of 3 weeks in Boston, and he sold 22 paintings on that leg of the trip, totaling more than $12,000. This was one of them. This is the Alcantara Bridge. So we talked about Berruete's Alcantara Bridge. This is the view from it in Toledo in 1906. So he and Berruete were together in Toledo painting in 1906. And this one, again, was acquired in Boston, and it's been in a private collection ever since. It's upstairs. All told, he sold close to 200 works on this trip to the United States, earning him close to $182,000, again in 1909, which would be great for an artist even today. The Hispanic Society eventually bought 26 of them out of this exhibition, and all told, Huntington owned 260 works by Sorolla and 8 by Zuluaga. After this, Sorolla had no use for those galleries in Europe. He never showed again commercially in Europe. All of his exhibitions were in the United States. And his work, including this one that I just wanted to end on because it's so stunning and it comes from this time, really show this carefree, beautiful, happy time to Americans who, for the first time, start having a leisure class. And so this one is also initially acquired in the United States. And Americans, of course, cannot get enough of Sorolla. And next week, we'll look at what happens when he goes into the heartland. Thank you. If there are any questions, Anne will come around with a microphone so that we can capture them for posterity. Yeah, Lynn, Anne will be right over.
Yeah, I know we kind of skipped over the social commentary on the paintings that he did, because it wasn't just La Margarita. There were a lot of fishing scenes too that were very
correct. Yeah, there were a lot of fishing scenes. Again, I was trying to fit a lot in to one morning, but yes, there were multiple. Yeah, there were more than just those few.
Was he flirting with pointillism?
Flirting with pointillism? I don't think he was. I don't think pointillism really was part of his repertoire the way it was, say, for those artists working in France. And certainly by the early 20th century, I mean, it was not as prevalent among avant-garde circles.
Nancy, you are the best story.
Thank you. Thank you.
It stuck in my mind. What did poor Mrs. Peacock insist on?
I don't know if she went back. That's a good question. So the question is, what did Mrs. Peacock live on for those remaining, 60 years? She may have gone, she may have had some money tucked away, but she may have become a shop girl again. I don't know. She's somebody I'd love to do more research on. I'm fascinated by her story. Yeah. Yeah.
Nancy, this is a great presentation. And it makes me realize how much of Sorolla's work is in the U.S. Actually, the Americas. There's a lot of it in
Correct.
Cuba and Latin America. And I'm curious as to whether there's ever been an accounting as to how much is in Americas versus in Spain of his works. Do you know?
I don't know, but I am sure that Blanca Ponce Sorolla has that information. She is also an incredible record keeper. The Sorolla in America exhibition was all work in the United States. Some of the work that's in the exhibition, there's one piece that I think that is from Mexico City. I mean, there's a lot definitely from the Americas, and I'm sure Blanca, as I said, would have an accounting. What's interesting in the research that came out of this current exhibition was there was work that was bought here that eventually went back to Spain. And there was work that was originally acquired in Spain that's now in American collections. So I think it's a very fluid topic. And I think it'd be something great to know. And I'm sure that Blanca has that data somewhere. I'd be curious to know. I'll see what I can find out.
That you would never buy a portrait of a living person. Could you tell us a little bit about what was most popular then, the portraits, the beach scenes, and how the collectors have changed through time in collecting Sorolla's different subjects?
Oh boy, that's a big question. In an attempt to get you out of here before 3, I think, they were making a living by all of these things. So obviously you're going to put into an exhibition, your beach scenes, because it's so easy to paint on the beach. And it's something Sorolla loved. I mean, I don't want to make it sound completely mercantile. He loved being at the beach. He loved being outside. He loved those beach scenes. And one of the things we talk to with our docents is that when you're touring school children, don't just think of these as something you're looking at. think of Sorolla being on that beach, hearing the sound, feeling the mist, etc. So a really full sensory thing. The portraits were largely done for one another. And so, yeah, I just think unless it was somebody I knew really well, I would not go into a gallery and buy, portrait of, I don't know, Joe Blow, just to have on my wall. But it could also have been a way of saying, oh, well, that's, Raimundo de Madrazo. I'd love to have a portrait of him on my wall. So, but I think that it was sort of, they just, as I said, they did not pigeonhole themselves into specific categories. If I'm in Seville, I'll paint gardens. If I'm in Valencia, I'll paint the beach. So does that answer your question at all? Did I help at all? Okay. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you.